Getting a little bit of a late start. We're going to look in Acts, be in Acts chapter 26 tonight. And we went through this chapter a few months ago when we talked about King Agrippa. We're going to look at it. We concentrated mostly on him the last time. Tonight we're studying the book, going through the book of Acts, and so we're going to be primarily looking at Paul's side of things tonight rather than Agrippa's. Now, remember, Paul has been through Felix, the governor. He defended himself to Felix, who heard Paul's side of things, and the Jews, the high priest and all his groups, things against Paul. Felix couldn't find anything wrong, couldn't find anything that even what the Jews had to say. He couldn't find where Paul had broken Roman law or Jewish law. Felix held him over for 2 years, for over 2 years, until Festus, who was Felix's replacement, had to sit and hear the same thing all over again. And so Festus, well, we know what we talked about before, Paul getting to preach the gospel to each one of these men, to Felix and Festus, and to from the start of this story to the high priest and everyone in the temple. The Sanhedrin, the Pharisees and the Sadducees all got to hear it. So Paul has followed the Great Commission that the Lord gave, preached the gospel to all those. Tonight, he has, in the last chapter, last part of the last chapter, we saw where he's with Festus in Festus's court, and King Agrippa and his sister Bernice come, and remember, King Agrippa is part of the Herod family, the very wicked family in Israel in that day, and they had been a series of kings who were part of that family, were sons and grandsons of Herod the Great, who had been in power at the time that Christ was born. And if I remember correctly, I believe Agrippa was, if he wasn't the last of that line, he was next to last, but I believe he might have been the last of that line. I didn't look at that for this study. I know we talked about it before, and I don't remember. But anyway, Paul is before Agrippa now, and Agrippa and Bernice have agreed, or have requested that Paul present his case to them. Agrippa has specifically told Festus, I want to hear from Paul. Remember, Agrippa is a Jew, was raised a Jew in Israel, in Jerusalem, in what his family considers royalty. Now, we know that they weren't true royalty in Jerusalem. They were placed in power by the Romans. They were not, if I'm understanding correctly, they were not of the lineage of David, so they were not true kings of Judah. They were not of the right line. But they were puppet kings, basically. They were put in power. They had some authority, and we'll see tonight, it comes out some where Agrippa shows his power a little bit. The Roman governors weren't necessarily under Agrippa. They had more power than he did, but they would look to him for advice because supposedly he was the Jewish expert in the government. He was the man who had been trained in the Jewish law and in the temple worship and all that. And so he was the man that they would go to if they needed advice on how to either control or how to work with the Jews. He was supposed to be the one in the know. Not always, and we'll see. You'll see that tonight and later too. Agrippa was not a good man at all. So let's start in chapter 26 in verse 1. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak. Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. Paul is testifying for himself. Remember, the Jews hired a high-powered lawyer to do all this. Paul didn't have money, so he couldn't hire a lawyer. 2, he didn't want a lawyer. Just like today, Roman law was very similar in some aspects to our own law, where when it came to a court hearing like this, Paul would have been offered a lawyer by the Roman government. He didn't want it. He wanted to defend himself because the Romans would not have offered him a Christian lawyer, if you will. He'd have been given whoever, like today, if you're defending yourself in court against a crime and you don't have the money, you're going to get whoever's free. And most of the time, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be an honest lawyer for sure, if there is such a thing. In verse 1, we see the beginning of Paul's his oration in front of Agrippa. He says, this is Paul speaking, I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews, especially because I know thee to be expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews, wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. Paul's happy, he says. He's excited to get to speak to, why? He gets to preach the gospel again. Unbeknownst to King Agrippa, he's going to get to hear it whether he wants it or not. And we'll see the results of that in a bit. But Paul is happy to get to tell his story again because his whole story revolves around the gospel. It revolves around the ministry that he has had for Jesus Christ. And so he gets to preach the gospel again to this man who has been raised as a Jew, who knows, as Paul says here, you know all the customs and the questions that the Jews have. So out of everybody that he's been before so far, Agrippa should be the fairest of the judges. He would be the one who knows both sides. He knows Roman law because he is a Roman puppet, remember, and being raised a Jew, he knows all the Jewish customs and laws. So he should be the fairest judge that he's been before so far because he knows both sides. That's another reason Paul's happy about it, because he finally gets to talk with someone who is probably similar as far as intelligence as Paul is as far as the law is concerned, on both sides. Remember, Felix and Festus didn't know the Jewish law. They didn't know that part of it. They were relying on what the Jews told them and what Paul told them. Agrippa knows both sides. My manner of life from my youth, which was at the first among mine own nation at Jerusalem, know all the Jews, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straightest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. So we see, and I believe, if I remember correctly, this is the first place that we see where Paul says that he was a Pharisee. I don't remember for sure, but I believe it's in one of the letters that he wrote where he mentions it again. But here he comes right out and says it, right out in the open. There's no doubt. He was raised a Pharisee. He was a Pharisee. and remember, history tells us, I don't believe this is in the scripture, but historians tell us that Paul's father was a Pharisee. And so